What do you think of Mom, Helen? I asked, unsure of how to phrase the question. He hesitated. What do I think of her? Well, she's someone who struggles to keep up with household chores. A bit slow, isn't she? He paused before adding, I guess, as a parent, I should scold you for saying that. But honestly, I can't argue because it's true. A sigh escaped his lips, as if the weight of that truth had finally settled in. Would you be happy with a new mom? I asked, curious but suddenly tense. He smiled faintly. Yeah, I think I would be. A cold knot formed in my stomach. A new mom. What does that even mean? My mind began to wander, grasping at dark possibilities. Cheating, divorce, ugly words that flashed before me like warning signs. But no, it couldn't be. Ewan would never. Would he? Just as my doubts turned into something closer to certainty, Ewan spoke again, this time with a smile that stretched across his face. Actually, I've been seeing someone. The words hit me like a slap. Trying to suppress the boiling anger, I forced myself to say, congratulations. My voice was strained, my fury barely contained. Inside, though, I felt it bubbling over, reaching its peak. I'm done, I declared, my voice cold. I'm quitting as both a mother and a wife. I'm also done being the one keeping this house afloat. From today, you're on your own. I could tell from the blank stares that my words hadn't sunk in, but I didn't care. Disappointment consumed me, and in that moment, I vowed to myself that I'd never let anyone betray me like this again. I'm Beth, 35 years old. Until recently, I juggled the roles of housewife and company employee, but life changed drastically when I married Yuan. 11 years ago, my marriage wasn't exactly a fairy tale. At that time, I was leading a major project, boosting the company's sales. I had proven myself, and my efforts didn't go unnoticed. I earned a raise along with the respect of my colleagues and superiors. Back then, work was everything to me. Marriage, it was barely a consideration. When family or friends asked, isn't it about time you found someone? I would shrug it off, saying, I'm not interested right now. That all changed after one particular evening. I had just finished a long day at the office when my boss, James, approached me. Beth, could I steal a few minutes of your time? I need some advice. James was the department head, a talented and well-respected leader despite being only 40. He had mentored me from the day I started at the company, guiding me through the learning curves of my career. How could I say no? Sure, I replied, curious. Relieved, he suggested, how about a drink at the bar nearby? I agreed, packed up my desk, and we headed out. As soon as we sat down, James downed 2 beers quickly, his face turning red. I knew he wasn't great with alcohol, so seeing him like this was unusual. Something was definitely on his mind. So, what's this consultation about? I asked, intrigued. Ah, he sighed, rubbing his temples. It's about a marriage meeting. The idea of James bringing up a marriage proposal was the last thing I expected. What could he possibly mean? I had always insisted that my career come first, pushing away any thoughts of marriage. No, I'm not really interested in arranged marriages, I said with a shrug. James smiled softly. I get that, but hear me out for a moment. Actually, I have a nephew who's about your age. Is that so? I replied, slightly intrigued. His name is Ewan, James continued. A while back, his wife left him, just disappeared one day. I felt a pang of sympathy. That must have been really tough. It was, James said, his voice growing quieter. It's a strange situation, but you actually look just like his ex-wife. I blinked, surprised, as James continued, looking somewhat guilty. I know it sounds rude to bring up a marriage proposal just because of that, but Ewan has a young child. It made me think, for a kid who barely remembers their mother's face, having someone who resembles her might not feel so strange. I could see the logic, even though it unsettled me. A child, after all, needed a mother figure, and here I was, single, around the right age, and apparently resembling the woman who had abandoned them. James wasn't really asking for me to marry Ewan. He was asking me to fill that void, to step into a motherly role. It made sense, but it also felt wrong. I was appalled. My feelings, my individuality, had been completely overlooked. But I understood why James approached it as a consultation. He wasn't pushing me, just trying to find a solution for his nephew. After all, I had never even met Ewan. How could I give any kind of answer? I understand what you're saying, I replied carefully, but since I don't know Ewan, I honestly don't know how to respond. James nodded, looking thoughtful. Yeah, I get that. That's why I wanted to talk to you first. Actually, I've already spoken to Yuan a little and I was wondering if you might be willing to meet him. Just once. I wasn't interested in marriage, but James had always been someone I respected, and I wanted to help in some way. After thinking it over, I agreed to meet Yuan. Just once. A few days later, the meeting was set. Yuan had arranged for us to meet at a high-end restaurant. I rarely frequented such places, and the thought made me a little nervous. Good evening, a clean-cut man greeted me as I arrived. He had an air of confidence and politeness about him. Good evening, I replied. You must be Yuan. That's me, he said with a smile. I'm glad to meet you. My uncle has told me a lot about you. Yuan was tall and slender, dressed impeccably in a suit that made him look like he had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. He escorted me to our table, and we spent the evening talking about everything under the sun. To my surprise, he never once mentioned anything about me resembling his ex-wife. Instead, he was genuine and kind, and I found myself drawn to his straightforward personality. As the evening wore on, I realized I was enjoying his company more than I had expected. After that dinner, we started seeing each other more often, and before I knew it, my feelings for Yuan had deepened. Then, one day, Yuan invited me back to the same restaurant where we had first met. We enjoyed a quiet, elegant dinner, and as we finished our meal and sipped wine, something cold touched my lips. Take a closer look, Yuan said with a playful smile. I looked down at the bottom of the glass, and there it was, a sparkling diamond ring rolling gently against the glass. Yuan reached for my hand. Beth, through all our conversations and time together, I've come to deeply love you, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I smiled, overwhelmed. Yes, I replied. Yuan hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. You might have heard from my uncle that you resemble my ex-wife. I nodded, feeling the small ache of hurt but remaining silent, waiting for him to continue. But he added, his gaze softening as he looked into my eyes, my love for you isn't based on something as superficial as that. It's you, Beth, everything about you that I've fallen for. And in that moment, any doubt I had melted away. I'm truly drawn to your inner self, Yuan confessed, his face slightly flushed. Whether from shyness or the wine, I wasn't sure. So, if you're willing, would you marry me? Yuan had always been a gentleman on our dates. Sincere in his words, always showering me with compliments. I had spent my life focused on my career, but in that moment, I realized there was more I wanted. I had desires beyond my work, desires as a woman. Yes, I'd love to, I replied softly. I accept. And so, Yuan and I got married. As a condition of our marriage, I was asked to quit my job and become a housewife. It wasn't that I didn't feel some regret about leaving my career behind, but I wanted to support Yuan as his wife, so I agreed. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Yuan was now my husband, and his daughter Helen became part of my daily life. It could have been a story of a simple, happy family, but life always has its unexpected turns. 11 years into our marriage, things began to change. Yuan's demeanor shifted. He became irritable, quick to anger over the smallest things. Perhaps it was the stress of work, but the man I had fallen in love with seemed to vanish, replaced by someone who raised his voice at every minor dissatisfaction. This, I told myself, was part of life. I bore his outbursts in silence, continuing to fulfill my role as a housewife. But soon the problem wasn't just Yuan's behavior. Helen, once sweet, now began to verbally abuse me as well. Whenever I tried to discipline her, Yuan would intervene. Don't be so harsh, he'd say, dismissing my concerns. It's your fault for not managing the house better. With her father's approval, Helen's insults grew worse, especially when he was around. I had thought it was just a phase, but her cruelty became relentless. One day, I asked her to clean her room. She didn't move, instead looking at me with disdain. Mom should do it, she retorted coldly. I brought this up to Yuan, hoping he would help, but he barely listened, showing no interest in parenting. You're the one raising her this way, he said, brushing off my concerns. Being a housewife must be easy. You don't even have to work. Just take care of the house. His words cut deep. It had been Yuan who insisted I leave my career, and yet here he was, diminishing my efforts as if my work at home meant nothing. When I tried to express my frustration, I was met only with sarcasm. You should only start complaining once you can actually do the housework properly, he sneered. Even after 10 years, you're still useless. My patience was wearing thin, no matter how hard I tried. My love for Yuan and Helen faded a little more each day. I felt trapped in a cycle of disrespect and neglect. As long as their attitudes remained unchanged, this situation would continue. I felt sorry for James, who had introduced us, but it seemed there was nothing left to be done. Despite my best efforts, I remained the target of constant criticism from both my husband and stepdaughter, and my heart grew colder with each passing day. I had always done my best to fulfill my role as a stay-at-home mom, but it seemed that time had finally caught up with me. One weekend, as I walked from my room to the bathroom, I overheard Yuan and Helen talking in the living room. I initially thought it was just more of their usual complaints, but I couldn't help but listen in. "What do you think about Mom?" Helen asked. "What do I think about her? She's slow and can't even manage the household chores properly," Yuan replied. "As a parent, I should probably scold you for saying this, but I can't argue because it's true." Their bluntness made me sigh involuntarily. But what came next was even more shocking. "Would you be happy if we got a new mom?" Yuan asked. "I would be happy," Helen answered. "A new mom? What does that mean?" I wondered, my mind racing with unsettling thoughts. Words like cheating and divorce swirled through my head. Though I didn't want to believe Yuan capable of such betrayal, my suspicions quickly solidified into reality. "Actually, I'm seeing someone," Yuan announced with a broad smile. The audacity of him discussing his affairs so openly with his daughter was beyond anything I could have imagined. This was a far cry from the Yuan I had once known. "Do you remember the woman who was with us the other day? Karen, she's really beautiful. I'm dating her now," Yuan said proudly. "What? Really? Congratulations," Helen replied, her seemingly innocent smile now appearing sinister to me. My patience was wearing thin, but I managed to stay calm enough to record their conversation on my smartphone. As they continued to discuss the affair with evident joy, I realized that any love I had for them had vanished completely. It was astonishing how quickly my feelings dissolved. I had clung to the hope that our family might find happiness again, but that hope was crushed. I felt a deep sense of betrayal and frustration, my tears reflecting the realization that they had turned their hearts elsewhere. In that moment of anguish, I vowed to seek revenge. I decided to hire a detective agency to gather information on the person my spouse was having an affair with. I already knew her name, so I expected the results to come through quickly. Gradually, I found a small sense of satisfaction in plotting my revenge. When I returned home, Helen confronted me as usual. "Did you go out to play somewhere since you don't work?" she asked dismissively. Her words barely registered with me now. All that remained in my heart was a growing sense of loathing for her. "Oh, by the way, there's an overnight school trip tomorrow. Make sure you prepare lunch," she added nonchalantly, as if tossing aside a piece of trash. Her blatant disregard stunned me, but panic soon set in as I realized I hadn't been informed about this earlier. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why keep this from me until now?" I asked, my voice a mix of panic and frustration. Yuan, who had been observing from the living room sofa, coldly told me not to make a fuss and just get it ready. I was too exhausted to argue, so I headed to the kitchen. As I prepared the lunch, I overheard Yuan and Helen chatting in the living room. "Helen, don't end up like that. Being a housewife is an easy job meant for those with low abilities. You're smart like me, so you'll get a job and work in the future," Yuan said. "Yeah, I'll definitely do that. It doesn't matter if Mom is here or not. I'll make sure to live independently," Helen responded. Her words would have been commendable if they weren't underscored by her earlier disdain. After finishing the lunch preparation and returning to the living room, I saw Yuan engrossed in his smartphone, smirking at something on the screen. I assumed he was playing an online game until I glanced at the screen and saw a photo of a young woman. It must have been his affair partner. I was stunned that he was so brazenly looking at her photo in front of me. My husband's obsession with his affair partner and my daughter's continued scorn reached a breaking point. In a surge of anger, I abandoned cleaning up the kitchen and locked myself in my room. The sound of their criticism from outside was now background noise to my resolve. I had made up my mind to leave this house. It might have seemed like a rash decision, but once Yuan's affair was exposed, I knew I had to go. Tomorrow became the day I would finally leave. Yuan and Helen no longer mattered to me. I announced to Helen, who was getting ready for school, and Yuan, who was dressing for work, "I'm quitting my roles as a mother, wife, and breadwinner today." With that, I confidently walked out of the house. They seemed stunned by my words, but it no longer mattered to me. I drove to my parents' house, which was a bit farther away, with my car packed full of my belongings. The statement about ending my role as the breadwinner held special significance. Ever since Helen started elementary school, I had noticed that the living expenses Yuan provided were dwindling. It became clear that he was probably spending the money on games or gambling before it even reached the household budget. Realizing this couldn't continue, I secretly started an ID consulting business from home without informing Yuan or Helen. My prior experience as a career woman proved beneficial, and the business became successful. Eventually, my income surpassed Yuan's, making me the primary provider for our household. The day after I left, Yuan bombarded me with emails, likely recognizing that the account for living expenses was nearly empty. I had withdrawn all the money I'd earned just before I left. The depleted balance was his own doing, and I didn't see it as my concern. Unable to handle the situation any longer, Yuan showed up at my parents' house. When the doorbell rang incessantly, I checked the intercom and saw a visibly distressed Yuan. Reluctantly, I answered the door, concerned that the noise might disturb the neighbors. As soon as I opened the door, Yuan began apologizing. "I was wrong. Please, can we go back to how things were? The house is a mess without someone to clean," he pleaded, treating me like nothing more than a maid. His apology felt more like a contemptuous routine than genuine remorse. I was thoroughly disgusted. "You don't need such an incompetent wife, do you?" I replied coldly and closed the door. Yuan continued to ring the bell for a while but eventually gave up and left, defeated, which I observed from the window. A week later, Helen called me, clearly distressed. I answered the phone with a hint of amusement as she began to rant. "Ever since you left, Dad hasn't been going to work, comes home late, and I can't keep up with household chores. My clothes are dirty, and I'm being laughed at school," she complained. Despite knowing my actions were harsh, I saw it as a consequence of their own making. "So what?" I asked. "It's not a so what, it's all because you abandoned us and left. Come back," Helen demanded, showing no remorse, only anger and dissatisfaction. "How convenient for you to demand that now. After all this time, you've treated me as if I were incompetent. If you're so capable, handling household chores should be a breeze, right?" I retorted, leaving Helen speechless. "Do it yourself," I said bluntly and hung up. Helen tried calling several times afterward, but I blocked her number to avoid further calls. Just when I thought I had found some peace, Yuan arrived at my parents' house with Helen a few days later, looking worn out. Yuan tried to persuade me to return, citing their financial struggles. "You're working, so wouldn't you be okay?" I dismissed him casually, and he persisted in his attempts to convince me. I had lent all my money to someone in need, likely his affair partner. It was clear that he was still trying to deceive me, but I was more astonished than outraged to learn that he still felt guilty. The living expenses had suddenly vanished. "Did you take them?" he asked, admitting his wrongdoing but begging me to return even a small portion. Faced with his accusation and feeling like a thief, I was momentarily speechless. I decided it was time to reveal the truth. I had been supporting our household with the income from my own company. My business, specializing in remote services and virtual spaces, was thriving, and my income far exceeded his annual salary. "That's nonsense. It has to be a lie," Yuan insisted. "I'm not lying. You've always belittled me, but in reality, I was the main provider. Rent, groceries, utilities, Helen's allowance, and school fees, all were covered by me," I explained. Their shocked and crumbling demeanor was almost comical. "It doesn't matter. Just come back. If not, I won't leave here," Yuan said, sitting on the floor like a petulant child, refusing to stand. Seeing their desperate pleas made me reconsider. I decided to return to the house with one goal in mind. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a sight that confirmed my decision. Unwashed clothes piled up in garbage bags stacked everywhere. Yuan's arrogance returned the moment he saw me. "See? Do your job as a full-time homemaker," he sneered, as if my return was some sort of triumph for him. "You should rely on your mistress instead," I retorted. "Mistress? What are you talking about?" Yuan feigned ignorance, though it was clear he knew. I presented the detective's report and played recordings from my smartphone. "Here's the evidence. Plus, you were openly discussing dates with her in the living room. You can't deny it." Yuan was speechless. "Anyway, I'm divorcing you. Don't ever show your face to me again." He continued to plead, but I was unmoved. "My income is many times yours. Do you think I have any reason to stay? If this doesn't convince you, we can go to court. You've used and insulted me for too long. Finally, he was left speechless. Helen, speaking up for her father, demanded, "It's the worst to abandon your own daughter. I'm a minor. You should take care of me. I can't stay in this house anymore. Take me with you." Her arrogance was infuriating. I firmly refused and decided to reveal a cruel truth. Helen and I were not blood relatives. We were complete strangers. Her shocked expression was almost satisfying. "What? I'm not your real mother. Your biological mother left, but Beth, your current mom, resembled her, and you took to her right away," I said, relishing her disbelief. "What? Dad, what's going on?" Helen's voice trembled with confusion. "Oh, your real mother ran away. Beth looked like her, so you accepted her as your mom," Yuan explained, though his words seemed half-hearted. Helen began to cry, unable to comprehend the deception. Despite my efforts to be a mother to her, it was clear this was the end. I no longer felt any love, only disdain. "You've always blamed me for everything. Fix it yourself," I said, and quickly left the house. After returning to my parents' home, they continued to contact me for a while, but I ignored them until the calls stopped. I divorced Yuan and demanded compensation from him and his mistress for the emotional distress they caused. Helen became more introverted and avoided people at school, her behavior leading to a lack of friends and apparent neglect. Yuan started missing work frequently and was eventually demoted. They eventually moved to a cheap apartment, struggling financially. I hope Helen reflects on her actions and matures into a respectable adult. Ultimately, Yuan was abandoned by both his wives, including me. My tumultuous marriage came to an end, but I am now thriving. My work is going well, and a new project is on the horizon. While the challenges of dealing with Yuan and his family were significant, I am dedicated to the success of my new endeavor and looking forward to a hopeful future.